He chose the altar to disappear. Under cathedral lights in Manhattan, Axel Vaughn adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the investors in the front row, and said clearly, carefully, "I can't do this. Not in private, not before dawn. Here, in front of cameras, contracts, witnesses." Brielle Hart didn't flinch. No tears, no questions. She stepped forward, took the microphone from the officiant, and looked at the room that had already decided her humiliation. "Good," she said quietly, "because I'm your new CEO. Some betrayals are impulsive. This one had been scheduled. If you've ever seen power abused in plain sight, don't look away from this story. Stay with it until the end. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. Subscribe if you believe silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strategy." In the months before the wedding, most people who worked at Vaughn Dynamics believed they understood Brielle Hart. They were wrong. From the outside, she fit a profile that made others comfortable. Mid-30s, precise, composed, educated at Columbia Law with an additional degree in finance that she rarely mentioned unless required. Her office was minimalist. No framed awards, no family photos, no unnecessary color. Just a desk, a monitor, a legal pad, and a clock that ran 3 minutes fast. People interpreted that clock differently. Some thought it was anxiety. Others assumed control. In truth, it was neither. It was calibration. Brielle preferred to arrive before things happened. She had joined Vaughn Dynamics 5 years earlier, recruited during a period when the company needed quiet stabilization after a volatile acquisition cycle. Officially, she was brought in as a senior financial strategist. Unofficially, she was there because the board no longer trusted internal reporting. Within 18 months, she became chief financial officer. No celebration followed. No internal announcement praised her ascent beyond a brief memo approved by Charles Vaughn, the company's CEO. Promotions inside Vaughn Dynamics were never about merit alone. They were about containment, about who could be trusted to hold sensitive information without making noise. Brielle understood that immediately. She did not ask for visibility. She did not request authority. She accepted responsibility, and with it access. That was enough. Axel Vaughn entered her life the way most things did in that company, quietly but with intention. He was already known before he spoke. The son of Charles Vaughn, educated abroad, featured in business magazines that described him as the future of Vaughn Dynamics, though no one could clearly define what he had built on his own. He was not incompetent. That would have been easier to manage. Axel was persuasive. He listened well in meetings, repeated key phrases at the right time, and understood how to position himself between decisions without ever appearing responsible for them. He smiled often, but rarely first. When he began attending executive briefings more regularly, Brielle noticed something others did not. He asked fewer questions than someone in his position should have. Not because he didn't understand, because he already knew which questions were safe. Their first direct interaction lasted less than 3 minutes. It happened after a quarterly review in a conference room that had already emptied. Brielle was organizing her notes when Axel approached, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, in a way that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be. "You move faster than the numbers," he said, glancing at her documents. Brielle didn't look up immediately. She finished aligning the pages before responding. "The numbers don't move," she said. "People do." A small pause followed. Not awkward, observational. Axel smiled, but there was a flicker of assessment behind it. "I've heard you're the reason we're still stable." "I've heard a lot of things too," Brielle replied, closing her folder. Neither of them extended the conversation. Neither needed to. But from that point forward, their interactions increased incrementally, deliberately. To the public, their relationship appeared organic. 2 high-level executives, shared meetings, late nights at the office, occasional appearances together at corporate events, photographs that looked candid but were rarely accidental. It didn't take long for media outlets to assign them a narrative, a power couple representing the next evolution of Vaughn dynamics. The company did not deny it. It also did not confirm it. That ambiguity was useful. Privately, the relationship followed a different structure. Axel initiated most personal conversations. He asked about Brielle's background, her education, her decision to enter both law and finance. She answered, but selectively. He spoke about expansion plans, about positioning the company for global relevance, about modernizing leadership. She listened. There were dinners, quiet, controlled environments where neither of them lost composure. There were conversations that circled around trust without ever naming it directly. At no point did Brielle mistake proximity for transparency. And at no point did Axel reveal more than he intended. There were signs, small, almost forgettable details that accumulated over time. Axel had a habit of redirecting conversations when specific financial structures were mentioned. Not abruptly, he was too skilled for that, but consistently enough that patterns formed. During internal presentations, he focused heavily on optics, how decisions would appear to investors, to the press, to regulatory bodies, rather than the decisions themselves. He maintained strong relationships with certain department heads, particularly those involved in compliance reporting. Not confrontational relationships, familiar ones, too familiar. Brielle did not confront him. She adjusted her observations. At night, long after the office emptied, Brielle remained at her desk. Not every night, just enough to avoid predictability. She reviewed reports that had already been approved, cross-referenced transactions that had already been cleared, not because she expected to find errors, but because she wanted to understand the system those numbers moved through. Her legal training shaped how she read financial data, not as isolated entries, but as potential testimony. Every number to her was a statement waiting to be challenged. The first irregularity was almost invisible. A transfer routed through a subsidiary that had been inactive for over a year. The amount was not large enough to trigger automatic review. The documentation was complete. The authorization chain appeared intact. It would have passed unnoticed. Except Brielle didn't rely on thresholds to determine relevance. She relied on continuity, and this transfer did not belong. She marked it, not in the system, not in a report, in her own notes. Over the following weeks, more discrepancies appeared. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that was careful, deliberate, but not perfect. Funds moved in intervals that suggested planning. Entities appeared and disappeared in cycles that aligned with reporting periods. Authorization signatures matched, but timing did not. Brielle did not escalate. She did not alert internal audit. She did not inform Charles Vaughn. Instead, she began building something parallel. A private record, encrypted, duplicated, stored outside company infrastructure. She saved emails before they could be archived. She documented meeting summaries in her own words, noting not just what was said, but what was avoided. She tracked names, and Axel's name appeared more often than it should have. He didn't know that yet, but he sensed a shift. People like Axel did not rely on evidence to detect change. They relied on atmosphere. Brielle spoke the same, moved the same, maintained the same schedule. But she stopped asking certain questions, and in that absence, something became visible. One evening, as the office lights dimmed automatically around them, Axel stood in Brielle's doorway. "You've been quiet," he said. She looked up from her screen, expression unchanged. "I usually am. Not like this." A pause. "What does like this mean?" she asked. Axel leaned against the doorframe, considering his answer. "Like you've already decided something." Brielle closed her laptop slowly. "Decisions don't happen all at once," she said. "They accumulate." Axel held her gaze a moment longer than usual. "About us too," Brielle didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. "Everything applies to everything." To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. The company continued to operate. The relationship continued to progress. The wedding planning moved forward, venue booked, guest list, curated, media partners quietly notified. But beneath that surface, Brielle's work had already begun. Not reaction, preparation. And by the time Axel Vaughn would stand at the altar and say, "I can't do this," Brielle Hart would already know why. At Vaughn, Dynamics' power was never announced. It was inherited, implied, or quietly reinforced through access. And no one embodied that more completely than Charles Vaughn. He did not raise his voice in meetings. He did not need to. His authority existed in the way others adjusted themselves before he spoke. How they shortened their explanations, how they avoided unnecessary detail, how they anticipated approval before asking for it. He had built Vaughn Dynamics from a mid-tier defense technology contractor into a multinational entity with government ties, private sector leverage, and a reputation that balanced innovation with discretion. Publicly, he was disciplined, strategic, untouchable. Privately, he was something else entirely. But that distinction was not immediately visible. Evelyn Vaughn, his wife, operated in a different sphere. Where Charles controlled infrastructure, Evelyn controlled perception. She curated the family's image with precision charity events, gallery appearances, carefully staged interviews that suggested warmth without vulnerability. She knew which journalists to trust, which narratives to encourage, and which details to erase before they surfaced. To her, Brielle Hart was not just a future daughter-in-law. She was an asset that required refinement. The first time Evelyn invited Brielle to lunch, it was framed as a gesture of inclusion. The location was deliberate, an upscale restaurant overlooking Central Park, discreet enough to avoid intrusion, visible enough to be noticed if necessary. Evelyn arrived early. Brielle arrived exactly on time. "You're punctual," Evelyn observed as Brielle took her seat. "I prefer clarity," Brielle replied. Evelyn smiled, though her eyes assessed more than they acknowledged. "Clarity is useful," she said, "but perception is what people remember." Brielle didn't respond immediately. She glanced briefly at the menu, then set it aside. "I assume you didn't invite me here to discuss timing," she said. Evelyn's smile widened slightly. "No. I invited you because you're about to become part of something larger than your role at the company." A pause. "Marriage in this family isn't just personal. It's structural." Brielle met her gaze without resistance. "I understand structure," she said. "I'm sure you do," Evelyn replied. "But understanding it and living inside it are different things." The conversation continued, but its purpose had already been established. Evelyn wasn't asking questions. She was defining expectations. Appearances would matter. Discretion would be required. Certain topics would never be discussed publicly. Certain decisions would be made collectively, even if they appeared individual. Brielle listened. She did not agree. She did not disagree. She absorbed. Back at Vaughn Dynamics, the environment reflected the same hierarchy. Departments operated independently, but all major decisions routed upward through layers that eventually converged under Charles Vaughn. Financial reporting followed strict protocols. Internal audits were scheduled, documented, and reviewed with a level of consistency that suggested reliability. But Brielle knew better than to equate structure with integrity. Structure, when designed correctly, could conceal as effectively as it revealed. Her review of the company's financial data had already begun to shift. What once appeared as isolated inconsistencies now formed connections. The inactive subsidiary she had flagged weeks earlier, Northlake Holdings LLC, was not inactive at all. It existed in cycles, dormant during standard reporting periods, active during off-cycle transactions that avoided immediate scrutiny. Funds moved through it in intervals that aligned with regulatory blind spots, small amounts, repeated patterns, intentional fragmentation. Brielle didn't confront anyone about Northlake. Instead, she expanded her scope. She mapped the flow of transactions across multiple subsidiaries, noting where timelines overlapped and where they diverged. She identified accounts that appeared unrelated but shared authorization signatures. And gradually, a network emerged. Not chaotic, engineered. One name appeared consistently across that network, not in large decisions, not in primary approvals, but in secondary confirmations, supplemental authorizations, mid-level validations that ensured continuity without drawing attention. Axel Vaughn. It would have been easier if his involvement had been obvious, if he had signed major transfers, if he had directly approved questionable activity. But that wasn't how the system worked. His role was subtle, supportive, necessary, which made it harder to define and harder to prove. When Brielle raised minor discrepancies during a financial review meeting, Axel responded the way he always did, calmly. "Those are legacy structures," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Some of these entities were set up years ago for flexibility. They're still being phased out." "Phased out," Brielle repeated. Gradually, Axel replied, "You know how these transitions work." Brielle nodded once. She did know, and that was the problem. After the meeting, as executives filtered out of the room, Brielle remained seated reviewing her notes. Axel approached her, closing the distance without hesitation. "You don't seem convinced," he said. Brielle didn't look up immediately. "Conviction isn't part of my job," she replied. "Verification is." Axel studied her for a moment. "You think something's wrong?" "I think something is consistent," Brielle said, finally meeting his gaze. "And consistency usually means intent." A brief silence followed. Then Axel smiled, controlled, measured. "You're very good at what you do." Brielle closed her folder. "That depends on what I'm looking for." There were others who noticed shifts within the company, but they interpreted them differently. Some employees sensed increased pressure from upper management. Others noticed tighter controls around information access. A few speculated about upcoming restructuring. No one connected those changes to Brielle. She did not signal investigation. She did not gather allies. She worked alone, except for one variable: Daniel Reeves. Daniel was not someone who stood out. Mid-level accountant, reliable, quiet. The kind of employee who followed procedures without questioning them until something forced him to. Brielle had observed him in meetings before. He rarely spoke unless addressed directly, but when he did, his responses were precise. He understood the system. More importantly, he respected it. Their first real conversation happened late one evening. Daniel was still at his desk when Brielle passed through the accounting floor. Most lights were off. The building had entered its after-hours state, secure, silent, controlled. "You're still here," Brielle said. Daniel looked up, slightly startled. "Just finishing reconciliation reports," he replied. Brielle stepped closer, her attention already on the documents on his screen. "Northlake Holdings," she said. Daniel hesitated. "Temporary routing account," he said carefully. "Temporary implies a defined end," Brielle replied. "When does that occur?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "It depends," he said. On what? Daniel glanced around, as if confirming they were alone, on when it's no longer needed. That answer stayed with Brielle. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it avoided. 2 days later, Daniel Reeves was terminated. The official reason was procedural error, a discrepancy in documentation, a violation of internal policy. The explanation was clean, justified, final. Brielle read the termination report without expression. Then she opened her private files. Daniel's name had already been recorded. Now it was marked. She returned to her analysis with increased precision. Time frames tightened, connections deepened, and the structures she had begun to map became clearer. This was not mismanagement. It was not oversight. It was design. And design implied authorship. Late one evening, as Brielle reviewed a sequence of transactions that looped through 3 separate entities before returning to a primary account, her phone vibrated, an unknown number. She didn't answer immediately. She let it ring once, twice, then she picked up. Silence, not accidental, deliberate. "Wrong number," Brielle said, and ended the call. Minutes later, an email appeared in her inbox. No subject line, no sender name, just an attachment. Brielle didn't open it right away. She saved it, duplicated it, stored it in an isolated environment. Only then did she review its contents. It was a single document, a transaction log, unofficial, unfiltered, and far more detailed than anything she had access to internally. At the bottom of the file, one line stood out. A routing sequence that connected Northlake Holdings to a larger entity Brielle had not yet identified. And attached to that sequence, a signature. Not Axel's. Charles Vaughn. Brielle leaned back in her chair, the document still open in front of her. For the first time, the structure she'd been tracing shifted into focus. Axel was part of the system, but he was not the system, which meant one thing. This was bigger than she had initially calculated. And by the time the wedding invitations had been sent, the venue secured, and the public narrative fully constructed, Brielle Hart was no longer trying to understand what was happening inside Vaughn Dynamics. She was preparing to prove it. By the time Daniel Reeves's access credentials were permanently deactivated, his presence inside Vaughn Dynamics had already begun to dissolve. His desk was cleared within hours. His name was removed from internal directories by the end of the day. By the following morning, it was as if he had never been there at all. That was how the company handled disruptions. Quietly, efficiently, without residue. Brielle noticed every step of that process, not because it was unusual, but because it was consistent. She had seen variations of this before. Employees who asked the wrong question, who noticed the wrong pattern, who hesitated at the wrong moment. They were never confronted publicly. There were no dramatic exits, only controlled removals that preserved the appearance of stability. Daniel's mistake had not been procedural. It had been awareness. And someone had decided that awareness was no longer acceptable. Brielle did not attend the internal briefing that followed his termination. She did not need to. The official explanation would match the documentation. The documentation would align with policy, and the policy would justify the decision. That was how systems protected themselves, by making every outcome look reasonable. Instead, she remained in her office reviewing the transaction log that had been sent anonymously the night before. The file was structured differently from internal reports. It did not follow the company's formatting standards. It was not filtered through compliance language. It showed raw movement, unedited and uninterrupted. Money did not disappear in that document. It traveled through Northlake Holdings, through secondary shells, through accounts that existed just long enough to receive and redirect. And at the center of several of those sequences was a pattern Brielle had not fully understood until now. Authorization layering. Primary signatures appeared legitimate. Secondary confirmations reinforced them. Tertiary approvals created distance between the origin and the end point. It was not just about moving funds. It was about diffusing responsibility. Brielle cross-referenced the anonymous file with her own records. The alignment was not perfect, but it was close enough to confirm authenticity. Someone inside the system had access to data that bypassed internal controls. Someone had chosen to share it with her. She did not try to identify the sender. That would come later. For now, the information was enough. She began reconstructing the flow, not as isolated transactions, but as sequences. Each sequence had a beginning, a path, and an exit point. Each one corresponded to a reporting gap. Each one relied on timing more than volume. This was not theft in the traditional sense. It was extraction through invisibility. Brielle documented everything, not in company files, not in any system that could be audited or accessed. She used her own structure: encrypted folders, redundant backups, physical notes written in shorthand that only she could interpret. Her legal training guided the process. Evidence was not just about possession. It was about admissibility, chain of custody, continuity, intent. She built her archive as if it would one day be examined under oath. Because she already knew it would. Outside her office, Vaughn Dynamics continued to operate as if nothing had changed. Quarterly projections were finalized. Investor communications were drafted. Media narratives were prepared in advance of the upcoming wedding, which had become more than a personal event. It was a signal, a consolidation of image power and continuity. Brielle was aware of how carefully that image was being constructed. She was also aware of how fragile it actually was. One inconsistency properly exposed could destabilize everything, but exposure required timing. And timing required patience. That was something Brielle had in abundance. Axel, on the other hand, was beginning to lose his. He appeared in her office without scheduling the meeting, closing the door behind him with a softness that suggested control rather than hesitation. "You've been going through old reports," he said. It was not a question. Brielle did not look up immediately. She finished typing a line in her notes before turning her attention to him. "I go through all reports," she replied. "Not like this." Axel stepped further into the room, his posture relaxed, but his eyes focused. "You're tracing something." Brielle observed him for a moment before responding. "Tracing implies uncertainty," she said. "I'm organizing." Axel exhaled slowly as if adjusting his approach. "Brielle, if there's something you think you're seeing, you should bring it to me." The statement was carefully phrased. Not bring it to the board, not bring it to compliance. To him. Brielle noticed that distinction. "And what would you do with it?" she asked. Axel hesitated. "Not long, just enough." "We would handle it internally," he said. Brielle leaned back slightly in her chair. "Internal handling tends to favor internal outcomes," she said. Axel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You don't trust the system." "I trust that the system behaves as it was designed to," Brielle replied. "And you think it was designed incorrectly. I think it was designed intentionally." Silence settled between them. Not hostile, measured. Axel studied her, as if recalibrating something he had previously assumed. "You're not going to let this go," he said. It was the closest he'd come to asking directly. Brielle did not answer in words. She simply held his gaze. That was enough. Axel nodded once more to himself, then to her. "Then be careful," he said quietly. It sounded like concern. It functioned as a warning. After he left, Brielle remained still for several seconds. Not because she was uncertain, but because she was confirming something. Axel knew more than he had admitted. Not everything, but enough to recognize risk, and enough to try to contain it. That made him part of the structure, not just adjacent to it. That distinction mattered. Later that evening, Brielle accessed a secondary archive she had begun constructing weeks earlier. This one was separate from her primary evidence file. It contained communication records, emails that had been flagged for deletion but intercepted before removal, calendar entries that had been altered after meetings concluded, internal memos that referenced decisions without documenting their origin, patterns of behavior, not just transactions, because in legal terms, behavior established intent, and intent established liability. She noticed something new. A sequence of deleted emails that had been routed through Axel's executive account but originated elsewhere. The sender field had been scrubbed, but metadata remained. Timestamps, routing paths, server identifiers. Brielle reconstructed the origin using fragments. The trail led back to an internal server cluster associated with executive communications. Restricted access, limited oversight, and under the direct control of Charles Vaughn's office. Brielle saved the reconstructed chain. Then she did something she had not done before. She printed it. Physical copies were harder to erase, harder to manipulate, harder to deny. She placed the documents in a sealed folder and stored them in a location outside her apartment. Not a safe, not a bank. A place that did not draw attention. Redundancy was not about paranoia. It was about inevitability. If one path failed, another remained. Days passed. The wedding approached. Public attention increased. Interviews were scheduled. Profiles were written. Photographs circulated. Brielle and Axel appeared together in controlled environments. Their interactions polished their expressions consistent with expectation. No one watching those images would have seen what was happening beneath them. No one would have recognized that the structure supporting those smiles was already compromised. Except for one person. The sender. The anonymous source had not contacted her again. But the initial file had changed everything. It had accelerated her understanding. And it had confirmed something critical. She was not the only one watching. That meant the system was no longer closed. And once a system opened, even slightly, it became vulnerable. Brielle did not rush. She did not act prematurely. She continued to gather, to organize, to prepare. Because she understood something that others in that company did not. Exposure was not the moment of truth. It was the result of preparation. And by the time that moment arrived, it would not feel sudden. It would feel inevitable. Axel Vaughn would stand at the altar believing he still had control over the narrative. Charles Vaughn would sit in the front row believing the structure he built could not be challenged in public. Evelyn Vaughn would watch the room confident that perception could still be managed. But Brielle Hart already knew how each of those beliefs would fail. Not because she intended to destroy them, but because they had been built on something that could not survive verification. And she had already begun the process of proving it. Margaret Cole did not ask Brielle why she had requested the meeting. She already knew it wasn't casual. Their relationship went back nearly a decade to a lecture hall at Columbia Law, where Margaret had been a guest speaker discussing corporate liability in complex financial structures. Most students had taken notes. Brielle had asked questions that required follow-up meetings. Margaret remembered that. She also remembered how Brielle listened, not to respond, but to build. Now, years later, they sat across from each other in Margaret's office overlooking Lower Manhattan. The room was lined with case files, not for display, but for access. Nothing decorative. Everything functional. "You've brought documentation," Margaret said, nodding toward the folder Brielle had placed on the desk. "Yes. Internal originally." Margaret leaned back slightly. That word usually comes with complications. It does. Brielle didn't elaborate immediately. She opened the folder and slid a set of printed documents across the desk. Transaction logs, authorization layers, reconstructed email chains. Margaret did not interrupt as she reviewed them. Minutes passed. The silence was not empty. It was evaluative. When Margaret finally looked up, her expression had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to indicate recalibration. "How long have you been tracking this?" she asked. "Several weeks," Brielle replied. "Possibly longer, depending on where it started." Margaret nodded once. "And you're certain these records are accurate?" "Yes. No gaps, no assumptions only, patterns supported by duplication." Margaret considered that phrasing carefully. "You're not speculating," she said. "I'm preparing." Margaret's gaze held steady. For what Brielle met it without hesitation. For scrutiny. Margaret closed the folder and placed her hand over it briefly as if anchoring its contents. "What you're describing," she said, "is structured financial misconduct. Possibly securities fraud, depending on how these transactions were reported." "Yes. And you're currently the chief financial officer of the company involved." "Yes." Margaret exhaled slowly. "That places you in a very specific position." Brielle didn't respond. Margaret continued. "If this becomes public, you will not be viewed as an outsider exposing wrongdoing. You will be viewed as an executive who had access, authority, and responsibility. I understand." "Do you?" Margaret asked, her tone still even but more direct now, because understanding means recognizing that your silence up to this point can be interpreted as participation. Brielle's expression did not change, which is why timing matters, she said. Margaret studied her for a moment longer. "You're not here to ask whether this is illegal," she said. "No. You're here to determine how to proceed." "Yes." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Then I'll be clear," she said. "If you act without sufficient documentation, you risk being absorbed into the fallout. If you act too late, you risk being associated with the intent. And if you act without legal structure, you risk losing control of the narrative entirely. Brielle listened. Every word aligned with what she had already calculated. What would sufficient documentation require, she asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She reopened the folder and reviewed a specific section. You need continuity, she said. A clear chain that shows not just that funds moved, but how, why, and under whose authority. I'm building that. You need corroboration, Margaret continued. Independent verification that these structures exist beyond your own records. I have partial confirmation. Partial is not enough. Brielle nodded once. Margaret closed the folder again. And you need protection, she said. Brielle's gaze sharpened slightly. In what form? Legal positioning, Margaret replied. If you're going to expose this, you do it as someone who identified, documented, and reported misconduct, not someone who was entangled in it. Brielle absorbed that. Not as instruction, as refinement. There was a pause. Margaret leaned back again, her expression shifting from analytical to something more measured. There's another factor, she said. Brielle waited. You're engaged to Axel Vaughn? Yes. Margaret's eyes held hers. And his father is the central authority in the structure? Yes. Margaret nodded slowly. That complicates perception. It does. Are you certain Axel is involved? Brielle did not answer immediately. She reached into the folder and removed a single page. A transaction sequence with layered authorizations. Margaret reviewed it. Secondary confirmations, she said. He's not initiating, but he's reinforcing. Yes. Margaret looked up. That suggests awareness? Yes, but not necessarily control. No. Margaret set the page down, which means he may try to position himself as uninformed. Brielle's voice remained steady. He won't be able to. Margaret studied her again. You're confident. I'm prepared. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed legal frameworks, reporting channels, federal oversight bodies that would become involved once the information surfaced. Margaret outlined potential outcomes: investigations, freezes on assets, public scrutiny that would extend beyond the company into personal reputations. None of it surprised Brielle. She had already considered those consequences. What mattered was a sequence: how the information would be released, when, and under what authority. You cannot improvise this, Margaret said at one point. I'm not planning to, good, Margaret replied. Because once it starts, you don't get to adjust. When Brielle left the office, the city outside had already shifted into evening. Lights reflected off glass buildings. Traffic moved in controlled patterns. Everything appeared ordered. She walked without rushing, not because she had time, but because she had already accounted for its use. Her phone remained silent. No messages from Axel. No follow-up from the anonymous sender. That absence was expected. Silence, in her experience, was rarely empty. It was usually strategic. The next morning, Vaughn Dynamics resumed its rhythm. Meetings, reports, decisions framed as progress. Brielle moved through them all without deviation. But internally, her approach had changed. Margaret had confirmed what she already knew. This was no longer just about understanding the system. It was about positioning herself outside of it, legally, structurally, and visibly. That required one thing above all: control over timing. Later that week, Axel proposed. The setting was not private. It was a corporate event, a product launch attended by investors, media, and industry figures. The moment was integrated into the program seamlessly, as if it had always been part of the evening. Axel took the stage, spoke briefly about the company's future, then shifted effortlessly into something more personal. Brielle, he said, turning toward her. Cameras adjusted instantly. The room quieted. This company has always been about building something that lasts, Axel continued. And I want to build something with you. He reached into his pocket. The ring was expected. The proposal was not. At least, not by everyone. Brielle stood where she was aware of every lens, every angle, every implication. This was not just a question. It was a declaration. a consolidation of image, of alignment, of narrative. For a moment the room held its breath, not because they doubted her answer, but because they understood its significance. Brielle stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, deliberately. She looked at Axel, then at the audience, then back at Axel. "Yes," she said. Applause followed. Cameras flashed. The moment was captured, distributed, and archived before the evening ended. By morning, it would be everywhere. The engagement of Axel Vaughn and Brielle Hart. The future of Vaughn Dynamics. Stability, continuity, trust. What no one in that room understood. Not Axel, not Charles, not Evelyn, not the investors who applauded or the journalists who documented the moment, was that Brielle's answer had never been about acceptance. It had been about access. Marriage would give her proximity she did not yet have, visibility she could not request, and protection temporary but useful within a structure that believed it had already secured her loyalty. Brielle did not believe in impulsive decisions. She believed in positioned outcomes, and by the time she said yes, she had already calculated what that answer would allow her to reach. The wedding date was set within weeks. Plans accelerated, expectations solidified. The narrative moved forward exactly as intended, and beneath it, unseen, unchallenged. Still incomplete, Brielle Hart continued building the case that would eventually bring all of it into the light. The announcement of the engagement altered the company's internal rhythm without changing its structure. Externally, Vaughn Dynamics leaned into the narrative with controlled enthusiasm. Press releases were issued. Industry publications ran features describing the union as a strategic alignment of leadership and vision. Photographs from the proposal circulated across financial media platforms, carefully edited to emphasize composure, confidence, and continuity. Internally, nothing was said. No official memo addressed the engagement. No meeting acknowledged it. The company maintained its posture of neutrality as if personal developments at the executive level existed outside operational relevance. But Brielle understood how influence moved through that environment. Silence did not mean absence. It meant integration. Wedding preparations began immediately, not as a personal project, but as an extension of corporate image management. Evelyn Vaughn took control of logistics. The venue was selected within days. A cathedral in Manhattan, with architectural weight and historical significance. The guest list expanded beyond family and friends to include investors, board members, political figures, and media representatives, who would not be formally invited but would inevitably be aware. Every detail served a function: placement, visibility, narrative. Brielle participated where required. She attended fittings, reviewed schedules, approved decisions when her input was requested. She did not initiate changes. She did not express preferences. To Evelyn, this appeared as adaptability. To others, it reinforced the perception that Brielle understood her role. In reality, it gave Brielle something more valuable: time. While preparations continued publicly, Brielle's investigation deepened privately. Margaret's guidance had shifted her approach. It was no longer enough to identify patterns. She needed confirmation that would stand outside her own analysis. Independent verification. That meant accessing layers of the system that were not visible through standard financial reporting. She began with the offshore structures. North Lake Holdings had already revealed part of the network, but it was only one entry point. Using the transaction sequences from the anonymous file, Brielle traced the flow outward. Each transfer connected to an entity registered in jurisdictions known for limited disclosure requirements. The structures were consistent. Shell companies with minimal operational presence. Directors whose names appeared across multiple organizations. Addresses that existed on paper, but not in practice. Brielle mapped them carefully, not as isolated nodes, as a system of circulation. Funds moved through these entities in loops returning to primary accounts under different classifications: revenue, consulting fees, asset reallocation. Terminology that obscured origin while preserving legitimacy. What changed everything was not the movement itself. It was the signatures. Axel's name appeared frequently, not at the start of transactions, not at the end, but in the middle. Secondary authorization, validation, continuity. He was not initiating the structure. He was sustaining it. Charles Vaughn's involvement, however, operated differently. His name appeared at critical junctions, points where large volumes shifted, moments where decisions altered direction. He did not appear often, but when he did, the impact was measurable. Brielle documented the distinction, because in legal terms, roles defined responsibility, and responsibility defined consequence. Late one evening, Brielle accessed a restricted database she had not previously used. Executive-level communication logs. Not emails, metadata, timestamps, access points, patterns of interaction between accounts. The system was designed to track usage, not content. But usage told its own story. She filtered for Axel, then for Charles, then for overlapping activity. What she found was consistent with everything else. Periods of heightened communication aligned with transaction spikes. Late-night access. Short bursts of activity followed by silence. Sequences that suggested coordination without direct documentation. It was not proof, not yet, but it was alignment. And alignment, when supported by financial data, moved closer to evidence. Axel noticed the shift before he understood it. He did not see Brielle accessing databases. He did not see her reconstructing systems. But he sensed the distance, not emotional, structural. Their conversations became shorter, more precise, less exploratory. Brielle no longer asked open-ended questions. She responded. She observed. She allowed silence to remain unfilled. One evening, as they reviewed seating arrangements for the wedding, Axel set the tablet aside. "You're not here," he said. Brielle looked at him. "I'm sitting in front of you." "That's not what I mean." He leaned forward slightly. "You've been elsewhere for weeks." Brielle considered him. "What would you prefer?" she asked. "Engagement. I would prefer honesty." The word lingered, not because it was unexpected, but because of its timing. Brielle's expression did not change. "Honesty depends on context," she said. "Then give me context." A pause. Brielle closed the seating chart. "What would you do with it?" she asked. Axel's jaw tightened slightly. "Why do you always answer questions with questions?" "Because answers tend to be used." "For what? For positioning." Axel exhaled, frustrated now. "This isn't a negotiation, Brielle." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." He watched her for a moment longer. Then something in his posture shifted. Not defensiveness, recognition. "You think I'm involved in something," he said. Brielle did not confirm it. She did not deny it. She simply held his gaze. That was enough. Axel leaned back, processing. "You don't understand how this works," he said after a moment. Brielle's voice remained calm. "Then explain it." Another pause. This one longer, more deliberate. "It's not as simple as you think," Axel said finally. "It rarely is. There are structures in place," he continued. "Decisions that were made long before either of us were in a position to question them. And you chose not to question them anyway." Axel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think I had a choice?" Brielle tilted her head almost imperceptibly. "There's always a choice," she said. "There just isn't always a consequence you're willing to accept." The room fell silent, not tense, resolved. Axel stood. "This isn't something you can fix by exposing it," he said. "I'm not trying to fix it." "Then what are you trying to do?" Brielle's answer was immediate. "Clarify it." Axel looked at her as if searching for something he had not yet seen. Then he nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. "You're going to regret that," he said quietly. Brielle didn't respond, because regret was not part of her calculations. After he left, Brielle returned to her work. The conversation had confirmed what she needed. Axel was not ignorant. He was compliant. And compliance in systems like this carried its own liability. The wedding approached. Final arrangements were completed, security protocols were reviewed. Media presence was coordinated. Everything aligned with expectation. But beneath that alignment, Brielle had reached a new threshold. Her documentation was no longer partial. It was comprehensive. Transaction records, authorization chains, communication patterns, independent verification from offshore registries, and one final component she had been waiting to secure: access to the board. Through her position as CFO, Brielle had maintained formal communication with select members. Until now, those interactions had remained within operational boundaries. That was about to change. She drafted a report, not for internal circulation, not for discussion, for record. It was precise, structured, legally framed. It did not accuse, it presented data, timelines, correlations, and at the end, a single statement. Further review is required under independent authority. She did not send it immediately. She scheduled it. Timing has always mattered. By the time Axel Vaughn would stand at the altar and say, "I can't do this," the board would already be aware. The evidence would already exist outside the company's control, and the structure that had protected Vaughn Dynamics for years would no longer be contained within it. Brielle closed her laptop, saved her files, and prepared for the final phase. Not exposure, execution. By the time the board began to respond, Brielle had already anticipated the order in which they would read her report. Not all at once, not with equal urgency. Board members did not operate as a single unit. They functioned as individuals first aligned only when necessary. Some would open the document immediately. Others would delay, waiting to see if additional communication followed. A few would forward it to legal counsel before reading a single line. Brielle accounted for all of them. The report had not been written to persuade. It had been structured to withstand fragmentation. Each section stood on its own. Each data point linked to an independent source. Each conclusion was supported by documentation that did not require interpretation. She did not ask the board to act. She ensured they could not ignore. The first reply arrived within 6 hours. Not a decision, a request. Clarification on transaction sequences involving Northlake Holdings and its related entities. Brielle responded with attachments. Time-stamped, indexed, unambiguous. She did not add commentary. The second reply came later that evening. A different tone, more direct. An inquiry regarding her awareness timeline. When had she first identified irregularities? What steps had she taken internally? Whether any discussions had occurred with executive leadership. Brielle answered precisely. Dates, actions, silence were appropriate. She did not mention Axel. Not yet. The third response did not come in the form of a message. It came as a meeting, unscheduled, restricted, attendance limited to 3 board members and external legal counsel. The invitation was delivered through a secure channel. No subject line, no description, only a time. Brielle accepted. She did not inform Axel. She did not inform Charles. She did not inform anyone. The meeting took place in a conference room that was not used for standard operations. No branding, no digital recording, no internal staff, only presence. Brielle arrived first. She chose her seat carefully, not at the head of the table, not at the edge. Position mattered. So did neutrality. When the others entered, introductions were minimal. Names were known. Roles were understood. There was no need for formality. One of the board members, a man in his late 60s with a background in regulatory law, spoke first. "You understand the implications of what you've submitted?" It was not a question. "Yes," Brielle replied. "And you are prepared to support every element of it?" "Yes." The external counsel leaned forward slightly. "We will need to verify independently, of course. And if verification confirms your findings, this will trigger mandatory reporting." Brielle nodded. "I'm aware." A pause followed, measured, evaluative. Then the same board member spoke again. "You've positioned this carefully." Brielle did not respond. "You've documented your timeline." "Yes." "You've preserved evidence outside internal systems." "Yes." He studied her for a moment. You anticipated this? Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Not because they doubted her, but because they understood what came next. Why now, he asked. Brielle met his gaze. Because the structure is complete, she said. And so is the documentation. The answer was sufficient. Not emotional, not strategic in appearance, but final. The meeting ended without conclusion. No decision was announced. No outcome was defined. But the process had begun. And once initiated at that level, it could not be reversed internally. Outside the room, Vaughn dynamics continued as if nothing had changed. But something had. Authority had shifted, not publicly, not visibly, but structurally. And Brielle had moved from observer to participant in a process that no longer belonged to the company. Later that evening, Axel appeared at her apartment without notice. This time, he did not pretend it was casual. You met with them, he said. Brielle opened the door without hesitation. Yes. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. How long have you been planning this? Planning what? Don't do that. His voice remained controlled, but the restraint was thinner now. You know what I mean. Brielle walked past him, placing her keys on the table. I plan everything she said. You'll need to be more specific. Axel turned to face her. The board doesn't move without reason. They had reason. You gave it to them. I provided information. That information puts my father under investigation. It puts the structure under review. Axel's jaw tightened and, you think that distinction matters? It will. A silence settled between them. Not the measured quiet they had maintained before. Something sharper, more defined. You could have come to me, Axel said. Brielle looked at him. And then what? I could have handled it. How? Another pause. Axel did not answer immediately, because there was no answer that would not confirm what Brielle already knew. That's what I thought, she said. Axel exhaled frustration, surfacing now. You don't understand the consequences. I do. No, you understand the mechanics, he said. Not the impact. Explain the difference. Axel took a step closer. This doesn't just affect the company, he said. It affects everything connected to it. People, contracts, governments. Brielle's expression remained steady. Then it should have been built differently. That's not how the world works. It is when it's exposed. Axel stared at her. Something in his expression shifted again. Not anger, recognition. You're not trying to fix this, he said. No, you're trying to end it. Brielle did not respond, because the distinction was no longer necessary. Axel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room. You're going to destroy everything. No, Brielle said quietly. I'm going to clarify what already exists. That's the same thing. It isn't. Axel stopped, turned back to her. And what about us? The question lingered. Not as strategy, as something closer to uncertainty. Brielle considered him, not as a partner, not as an opponent, as part of the structure she had already mapped. We were always part of the same system, she said, just not in the same way. Axel's voice lowered. That's not an answer. It's the only one that applies. Another silence. This one. Final. Axel nodded slowly. Not agreement. Acceptance. You've already decided, he said. Yes, and there's nothing I can say that changes that. No. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he stepped back. You should have told me, he said. Brielle didn't respond, because disclosure had never been part of her plan. Axel left without another word. The door closed. The apartment returned to stillness. Brielle remained where she was for several seconds. Not processing, confirming. Everything was aligned. The board had engaged. The evidence had been distributed. The structure was under review. And Axel had revealed exactly what she needed him to. Not denial, not ignorance, but awareness. That would matter. Later. For now, Brielle returned to her desk, opened her laptop, reviewed the schedule she had set days earlier. Emails queued, documents prepared, recipients confirmed. Nothing left to adjust. Only one variable remained: time. And time, unlike everything else in this process, moved forward without negotiation. By the time the wedding day arrived, the investigation would no longer be contained within internal channels. It would exist externally, legally, irreversibly. And when Axel Vaughn stood at the altar and said, "I can't do this," he would believe he was making a decision. But Brielle Hart already knew. The outcome had been determined long before he spoke. The night before the wedding did not feel ceremonial to Brielle, nor did it carry the kind of emotional weight that others around her seemed to expect. There were no restless thoughts, no rehearsed vows, no hesitation about what would happen the next day. Instead, there was a quiet, structured clarity, the kind that came only when every variable had already been accounted for and placed exactly where it needed to be. The city outside her apartment moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that several intersecting timelines were approaching a single point of convergence. Inside, Brielle sat at her desk with the same posture she had maintained for weeks, reviewing materials not because they required revision, but because repetition ensured precision. Each document had already been verified, cross-referenced, and secured in multiple locations. Yet she continued to move through them with measured attention, as if the act of reviewing itself reinforced the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Her laptop displayed a sequence of scheduled transmissions, each aligned to a specific time, each directed toward a different recipient. Members of the board would receive extended documentation, while external legal counsel would receive a structured summary with attached evidence sufficient to initiate formal review. Certain investigative journalists, selected not for their reach, but for their credibility, would receive a limited but compelling portion of the material. The distribution was intentional, staggered in such a way that no single entity would control the narrative once it began to move. Brielle did not rely on reaction. She relied on sequence. Her phone remained face down beside her silent until it vibrated once against the surface of the desk. The number displayed was unfamiliar, though that alone did not make it unexpected. She allowed it to ring twice, before answering, not out of hesitation, but because timing, even in small interactions, mattered. When she brought the phone to her ear, she did not speak immediately. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice she did not recognize. "You received the file." It was not phrased as a question. "Yes," Brielle replied. Another brief silence followed, as though the speaker was measuring how much to reveal. "You're moving faster than they anticipated," the voice said. "They assumed I wouldn't move at all." Brielle responded. A faint exhale came through the line, something close to acknowledgement. "They're starting to notice." "They already have," Brielle said calmly. This time, the pause was longer. "Then you understand what happens next." "I do." The voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in tone. "There are records you don't have yet." Brielle's gaze shifted toward her screen, though she did not break the rhythm of her breathing. "Where are they?" she asked. "I can't send them electronically," the voice replied. "Too many access points are being monitored now. That didn't stop you before. It will now." The distinction was subtle but meaningful. The system that had allowed information to move quietly before was beginning to tighten, likely as a response to the board's engagement and the early signs of internal review. "Then how?" Brielle asked. A brief hesitation preceded the answer. "Check the storage unit on West 47th, locker C19. Access code is already active." Brielle did not ask how the code had been obtained, nor did she ask who the speaker was. Those questions, while relevant, were not necessary at this stage. "What am I looking for?" she asked instead. "Physical records, originals, signed documents that were never digitized, that changed the scale. Digital records could be contested, altered, reinterpreted. Physical documents, especially those bearing original signatures, carried a different weight in legal proceedings. They established not only action, but intention in a way that was far more difficult to dispute." Brielle absorbed that, without visible reaction. "And why give them to me?" she asked. The answer came without hesitation this time. Because you're the only one who's positioned to use them correctly. There was no attempt to justify, no explanation of motive, no request for anything in return. Just a statement. Brielle accepted it for what it was. "I'll retrieve them," she said. The line went silent for a moment, then the voice spoke once more. "Be careful. They're not as unaware as they appear." "I'm not relying on their awareness," Brielle replied. The call ended without farewell. Brielle set the phone down. Her expression unchanged, though the implications of what she had just been given were significant. The existence of physical documents suggested that the structure she had been mapping extended further back than she had initially confirmed, and that at least one participant in that structure had chosen to preserve evidence outside the system designed to conceal it. She stood, retrieved her coat, and left the apartment without rushing. The night air carried the same neutral weight as always, neither anticipating nor reflecting the shift that was underway beneath its surface. When she reached the storage facility, the building appeared ordinary, its exterior offering no indication of the information it contained. Inside, the process was straightforward. A keypad, a corridor, rows of identical doors. Locker C19 opened without resistance. Inside, a single box. Brielle lifted it, noting the weight before placing it on the narrow metal shelf beside the locker. She opened it carefully, revealing a set of documents bound together with a simple clip, no labels, no markings to identify ownership. She began to review them immediately. Contracts, authorization forms, transfer agreements that predated the digital systems currently in use. Each document bore signatures not scanned or replicated, but written in ink. Among them, she recognized names that had appeared in her digital records now connected to physical proof. And then a sequence that aligned everything. A foundational agreement signed years earlier outlining a structure that allowed for the movement of funds through layered entities under the justification of international expansion. The language was precise, but its application, when viewed alongside the current transactions, revealed intent that could no longer be framed as operational flexibility. At the bottom of that document was a signature, Charles Vaughn, and beneath it, in a later amendment, another, Axel Vaughn. Not secondary, not supportive, direct. Brielle closed the folder slowly, not because she needed time to process, but because the final piece had now been confirmed. Axel's involvement was no longer limited to awareness or indirect participation. He had entered the structure formally, willingly, and with full authority. That distinction would matter. She returned the documents to the box, secured it, and exited the facility with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the evening. Back in her apartment, she integrated the new evidence into her existing archive, scanning each page, verifying each signature, and linking each document to the sequences she had already constructed. The structure was no longer a pattern. It was a case. Brielle adjusted her schedule accordingly. The transmissions would proceed as planned, but the inclusion of these documents would shift their impact. What had previously been a strong evidentiary chain was now definitive, supported by materials that could not be dismissed as interpretation or internal bias. Outside, the city moved closer to morning. Inside, Brielle completed the final review of her work. She did not feel urgency. She did not feel doubt. Only completion. By the time she closed her laptop, every element was in place, every path accounted for every outcome, aligned with the sequence she had built. Tomorrow, the ceremony would begin as expected. Guests would arrive. Cameras would record. Words would be spoken. But beneath that surface, a different process would already be in motion, one that did not depend on emotion, tradition, or appearance. When Axel Vaughn would stand at the altar and speak his refusal, he would believe he was interrupting something. In reality, he would be stepping directly into it. The morning of the wedding did not begin with anticipation. It began with alignment. By 8:30, the cathedral in Manhattan had already transitioned from architecture into stage. Every seat had been assigned, every aisle, measured not for movement, but for visibility. Light filtered through stained glass in controlled angles, casting color across polished stone in a way that suggested reverence, even though nothing about what was about to happen relied on faith. It relied on sequence. Brielle arrived before most of the guests, not as the bride, as the last variable to be placed. She stepped out of the car without hesitation, acknowledging no one directly, though several people turned the moment she appeared. Her dress had been selected weeks earlier not for beauty, but for neutrality. It did not distract. It did not invite interpretation. It allowed attention to remain where it would soon be required. Inside the space was already populated by early arrivals, investors who understood that proximity mattered, board members who understood that timing mattered more. They spoke in low tones, conversations structured around safe topics, none of which addressed the shift that had already begun moving beneath the surface. Because none of them were certain how much the others knew. Brielle noticed that immediately. The distance between them was not physical, it was informational. She moved through the space without interruption, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. She did not seek out Charles Vaughn. She did not acknowledge Evelyn. She did not look for Axel. She already knew where each of them would be. That knowledge had been established long before today. In a private room adjacent to the main hall, preparations continued around her. Assistants adjusted fabric. Voices filled silence that did not require filling. Questions were asked that did not require answers. Brielle allowed it, not because she needed assistance, but because resistance would create attention, and attention at this stage was unnecessary. Her phone remained within reach, screen dark, though she knew exactly what had already been sent. At 9:15, the first transmission had been delivered. Board members received the expanded file, now including scanned copies of the physical documents retrieved the night before. The signatures were clear. The dates aligned. The structure, once arguable, was now fixed in a form that could not be reinterpreted. At 9:20, external counsel received their version. Condensed, structured, sufficient. At 9:25, 2 investigative journalists received a limited release. Not enough to publish immediately. Enough to begin verification. Brielle did not check for responses. She did not need confirmation. The system had already shifted from internal to external. That transition did not reverse. In the main hall, Charles Vaughn had taken his seat. From a distance, nothing about him suggested disruption. He sat with the same composure he had carried into every board meeting, every negotiation, every decision that had reinforced his authority over the years. But the people around him had changed. Not in appearance, in posture. Conversations that would have included him now adjusted their distance. Eye contact was shorter. Engagement was measured. No one confronted him. Not yet. But the absence of ease had already begun. Charles noticed. He did not react, because reaction would confirm awareness. And awareness in his position had always been managed carefully. Evelyn Vaughn moved through the room with controlled precision, adjusting details that did not require adjustment, ensuring that nothing disrupted the image she had constructed. To her, the event was intact, stable, contained. She had spent years refining perception into something that could absorb almost any irregularity, as long as it was managed quickly enough. She did not yet realize that what had already begun could not be managed through appearance, because it no longer belonged to appearance. Axel arrived shortly before the ceremony, later than planned, early enough to avoid attention from those who did not understand timing, late enough to register with those who did. He entered through a side passage, avoiding the main aisle, his movement controlled, but not relaxed. His suit was perfectly arranged. His expression held. But something beneath that structure had shifted. He scanned the room once, not searching, assessing. His gaze paused briefly on the board members, then moved past them. He did not look at Brielle, not immediately, because looking would acknowledge something he was not prepared to define. In the private room, Brielle stood as the final adjustments were completed. A mirror stood in front of her, reflecting an image that others would interpret as composed, ready, aligned with expectation. She did not study it. She had already accounted for how she would appear. Instead, she checked her phone. Not for messages, for timing. 9:42. Everything had been delivered. Everything had been received. What remained was sequence. A soft knock signaled that it was time. The coordinator spoke gently as if volume might disrupt something fragile. "We're ready." Brielle nodded once. No hesitation, no visible shift. She stepped forward. The music began as expected, measured, controlled, the kind of sound that filled space without demanding attention. Guests turned, conversations stopped. The aisle, long and deliberate, created distance between entrance and altar, forcing every step to exist within observation. Brielle walked it without deviation. Not slowly, not quickly, at a pace that did not suggest performance. At the end of the aisle, Axel waited. From a distance, he appeared as he always had. Composed, structured, contained. Up close, the difference was visible. Not to everyone, but to Brielle, and to those who had already begun to understand that something had shifted. His eyes met hers briefly. In that moment, there was no confusion, no question, only recognition, not of what was happening, but of what had already been set in motion. The officiant began. Words that had been spoken countless times in that space, structured to guide, to formalize, to give meaning to something that, in this case, did not require it. Brielle listened, not to the content, to the timing. Each sentence moved them closer to the point where interruption would matter, because interruption in a space like this carried weight. It transformed private decision into public declaration. Axel knew that. That was why he had chosen this moment. Around them, the room held its attention. Guests watched, some with interest, some with calculation, some with a quiet awareness that this was not unfolding as expected, even if they could not yet identify why. Charles remained still. Evelyn watched closely. The board observed without speaking. The officiant reached the final sequence, the moment where confirmation became irreversible. A pause, a question. Axel inhaled, not deeply, but enough. "I can't do this." The words were clear, controlled, delivered with the precision of someone who had chosen them in advance. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, but immediate. Surprise, confusion, calculation. All attention shifted. To Brielle. She did not react, not in the way the room expected. No visible shock, no movement backward, no attempt to preserve the moment that had just been disrupted. Instead, she stepped forward. One movement, deliberate. She reached for the microphone. The officiant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then released it. Brielle turned, not to Axel, to the room, to the witnesses, to the structure that had been built to contain this moment. "Good," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because silence had already formed around her. "Because I am your new CEO." Some statements require explanation. This one did not, because at that exact moment, devices across the room began to respond. Phones vibrated, screens lit, emails opened, documents loaded. The sequence had reached its final phase. And what had been constructed as ceremony had just become evidence. For a moment after Brielle spoke, the cathedral did not react. Not because the room had not heard her, but because it had. An understanding required time. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, layered with recognition moving at different speeds through different minds. Some processed the words themselves. Others processed the implication. A few, the ones who had already received the documents, understood immediately that this was not a declaration. It was confirmation. Phones began to vibrate, almost in unison, a subtle but unmistakable disruption beneath the stillness. The sound did not belong in a space like this, which made it more noticeable. Heads turned not toward Brielle, but downward toward screens that were already illuminating information that had not been there minutes earlier. Board members checked their devices first, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. What they saw was not new. It was expanded, The documents Brielle had sent earlier that morning had updated. Additional files had been appended, including the scanned originals she had retrieved the night before. Signatures, dates, cross-referenced transactions, legal annotations embedded within the structure of the report. It was no longer a question of whether the system required review. It was already under review, and now it was visible. Across the aisle, one of the investors opened the same material forwarded through a channel that did not originate from Brielle directly. That detail mattered. It meant the information had already moved beyond her control, which was exactly the point. Charles Vaughn did not reach for his phone immediately. He remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression composed in a way that suggested either discipline or denial. Those who knew him understood that he would not react to something he had not yet fully assessed, but the shift around him was undeniable. Conversations that had paused now redirected. Attention that had been fixed on the altar dispersed outward toward devices, toward each other, toward the realization that this was no longer contained within the ceremony. Evelyn Vaughn stood, not abruptly, but with intention. Her gaze moved from Brielle to Axel, then to the surrounding guests, as if attempting to recalibrate the narrative in real time. She stepped forward slightly, her voice controlled when she spoke. "This isn't the place for this," she said. It was the first attempt to restore structure. Brielle did not respond, because location no longer mattered. Axel, however, did. He remained where he stood, though the composure he had maintained was beginning to fracture at the edges. His decision to speak first, to disrupt the ceremony on his own terms, had been calculated. What he had not calculated was losing control of what followed. "You planned this," he said, his voice low but no longer fully contained. Brielle turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, without shifting her position. "Yes," she said. There was no elaboration, no justification. The word itself carried more weight than any explanation. Axel's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. He understood now that his moment had not been interruption. It had been timing. "You use this," he continued, gesturing faintly toward the room, toward the guests, toward the structure that had been built for an entirely different purpose. Brielle's response remained steady. "I used what was already here." The distinction settled between them, because it was true. Nothing in this room had been created for her plan, but everything in it had been accounted for. Around them, the atmosphere shifted further. Legal counsel, seated several rows back, had already stepped aside to take a call. Their posture had changed, no longer that of observers, but of participants in a process that had just accelerated beyond internal control. Two members of the board exchanged a glance, brief but decisive. One of them stood not to intervene, but to exit. Not out of avoidance, but because action was now required elsewhere. That movement did not go unnoticed. Charles Vaughn saw it. And that was when he reached for his phone. The screen lit his face briefly, reflecting documents. He had not yet reviewed information that had been withheld from him until this moment. His eyes moved across the content with practiced speed. Not reading every line, but identifying structure, scanning for origin, tracing the path that had led to this point. He did not look surprised, but he did look recalibrated, which for someone like Charles was far more significant. When he finally stood, the room registered it immediately. Authority, even when compromised, still carried weight. "Everyone," he said, his voice measured, controlled, projecting just enough to reclaim attention without raising it. "This matter will be addressed appropriately. This is neither the time nor the setting for what." Brielle interrupted. Her voice did not rise, but it cut through his, not by force, by precision. Charles paused, not because he was uncertain, because interruption in this context required recalculation. "For discussion," he finished. Brielle turned fully toward him now. "This isn't discussion," she said. "It's documentation." A murmur moved through the room, not loud, but present, because the distinction mattered. Charles held her gaze. "You're making a mistake," he said. It sounded like warning. It functioned as acknowledgement. Brielle did not react to the tone, only to the content. "No," she replied. "I'm making a record." That was when the first external notification appeared. Not on Brielle's phone, on someone else's. A journalist seated near the back looked down at their screen, then up again, their expressions shifting as information connected. A message had come through not from Brielle, but from an editor. "Verification in progress. Request for confirmation." The story was already moving. It had left the room, which meant it could not be contained within it. Axel saw that too. And for the first time, uncertainty surfaced clearly. "This doesn't stop here," he said, his voice lower now, directed only at Brielle. "It wasn't meant to," she replied. "What do you think happens next?" Brielle looked at him, not with judgment, not with anger, with clarity. "The same thing that always happens when something is verified," she said. "It continues." Axel exhaled slowly, the weight of that settling in. Because continuation meant consequence. And consequence, once initiated at this level, did not differentiate between intent and involvement. It accounted for both. Behind them, movement increased. Guests began to stand not out of panic, but out of recognition that the event they had come to witness had changed form. Conversations resumed, but no longer about the ceremony. They centered on what had been revealed, what it implied, what it would mean moving forward. The cathedral designed to hold stillness could no longer contain it. Evelyn stepped back, her attempts to manage perception dissolving as the narrative moved beyond her reach. She did not speak again, because there was nothing left to frame. Charles remained standing, his phone still in his hand, his expression no longer composed in the way it had been earlier, not fractured, but adjusted. He was already calculating response. Legal, strategic, delayed. But he was no longer in control of timing. That belonged to Brielle. And Brielle had already used it. She lowered the microphone. Not abruptly, deliberately. The sound it made as it disconnected from her hand was small, but final. She did not look at Axel again. She did not address the room. She did not wait for reaction, because reaction was no longer relevant. Everything that needed to move had already begun moving. Everything that needed to be seen had already been delivered. Brielle stepped away from the altar, not as someone leaving a ceremony, but as someone exiting a structure that had just been exposed. And behind her, the system that had once operated in silence began finally to speak for itself. By the time Brielle stepped out of the cathedral, the process had already shifted beyond containment. What had begun as internal documentation had now entered circulation. And circulation did not ask for permission. It moved through networks that operated independently of Vaughn dynamics, through legal channels that did not recognize corporate hierarchy, through media systems that prioritized verification over discretion once a threshold had been crossed. That threshold had just been reached. Outside, the air carried a different kind of movement. Not visible, not immediate, but present in the way phones continued to vibrate. In the way conversations formed and dissolved without conclusion, in the way individuals who had arrived expecting to witness a ceremony now found themselves part of something else entirely. Brielle did not pause at the steps. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her that required confirmation. Instead, she walked toward the black car waiting at the curb, her pace unchanged, her posture steady. The driver opened the door without speaking as instructed, and Brielle entered without acknowledgement. Inside, the environment was controlled, quiet, contained. For the first time that morning, there were no external voices, no shifting attention, no need to account for observation, only sequence. Her phone lit up almost immediately, not with one message, with many. Board members, legal counsel, unknown numbers, recognized ones, all attempting to establish contact to clarify, to position themselves within what had just occurred. Brielle did not respond, not yet, because response implied engagement. And engagement at this stage required structure. She opened her laptop instead, connected to a secured network, reviewed the status of the transmissions she had scheduled. All had been delivered. All had been accessed. Some had already been forwarded beyond their initial recipients. The system was no longer centralized, which meant it was functioning exactly as intended. Inside the cathedral, the aftermath continued to unfold. Charles Vaughn had moved quickly once he understood the scope. He did not attempt to stop the spread. He could not. Instead, he shifted toward containment, legal containment. He stepped aside with counsel, his voice low, precise, issuing instructions that did not acknowledge panic-only response. Identify origin points, he said. Track external distribution. Prepare a statement. Each directive was logical. Each one was late, because the origin point was no longer singular. An external distribution had already diversified. Statements once useful for shaping perception would now be examined against evidence that had already begun to circulate. Evelyn stood apart, her earlier control replaced with something more rigid. Not confusion, not disbelief, but an awareness that perception alone could not correct what had just been revealed. She did not approach Charles. She did not speak to Axel. She remained still, watching the room as it transformed into something she had not prepared for. Axel had not moved. Not immediately. He remained at the altar longer than anyone expected, not because he did not understand what had happened, but because he did. And understanding required recalibration. His phone vibrated once, then again. He looked down. The first message was from a board member. Brief, direct. We need to speak. The second was from legal, more structured. Do not make any public statements. The third contained an attachment. He opened it. The document loaded quickly. Transaction sequences, authorization layers. Signatures. His name appeared, not where he had hoped it would. Not limited, not peripheral, integrated. Axel closed the file. Not because he had finished reading, because he had read enough. Outside, the first external confirmation arrived, not as a headline, as inquiry. A journalist, one of those who had received the limited release, contacted a secondary source for verification. That source, already aware of the board's internal engagement, did not deny. They did not confirm. They redirected, which in that system was confirmation. The story did not need to be written yet. It needed to be verified. And verification was already underway. In the car, Brielle reviewed the incoming legal notifications. Margaret had responded, not with questions, with structure. Proceeding with external filing, advising coordination with regulatory bodies, recommending immediate preservation orders on all relevant company data. Brielle read each line carefully, then she replied, acknowledged, authorized. There was no hesitation, because this phase had been anticipated. Minutes later, a new notification appeared. Federal inquiry initiated. Not formal yet, but active. That was the point at which internal processes lost priority. External authority had entered. And once it did, Vaughn Dynamics would no longer define the scope of its own investigation. Back at the cathedral, the room had begun to empty. Not abruptly, gradually. Guests exited in small groups, conversations, low-controlled, but focused. No one spoke about the ceremony. They spoke about the information, about timing, about implications. Investors considered exposure. Board members considered liability. Media representatives considered confirmation. No one remained neutral, because neutrality required distance. And distance no longer existed. Charles finished his call. He looked up. For the first time since the disruption, his attention moved toward the exit. Not toward Brielle, toward the absence she had left behind. He understood now that this had not been an impulsive act. It had been structured, sequenced, executed, which meant response would require the same. But response, unlike action, would now be constrained. Because the timing was no longer his. Axel stepped down from the altar. The movement was small, but final. He moved through the remaining guests without acknowledgement, his path direct, his focus internal. Outside, the air felt different, not because it had changed, but because context had. His phone continued to vibrate. He ignored it, for now, Because there was only one conversation that mattered, and it had already happened. In the car, Brielle closed her laptop, not because there was nothing left to review, but because the phase she had controlled had ended. What followed would not depend on her pacing. It would depend on process. Legal, procedural, public. She leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. There was no satisfaction in what had just occurred. No sense of victory. Only completion. The system had been exposed, not destroyed, not yet, but no longer concealed. And that was enough, for now. By the time the first formal request for comment was drafted by an external publication, the narrative had already begun to form. Not from statements, from evidence, emails, records, documents that spoke without interpretation. Brielle had not told the story. She had made it visible. And visibility, once established, did not reverse. As the car moved through the city, blending into traffic that had no awareness of what had just shifted, Brielle remained still. Not waiting, not reacting, simply present within a process that no longer required her to initiate anything further. Because everything that needed to begin already had. By early afternoon, the investigation had begun to take shape outside the boundaries of Vaughn Dynamics, moving through channels that operated without regard for the company's internal hierarchy or its long-established methods of control. What had once been contained within report signatures and carefully structured transactions was now being translated into a different language, one defined by legal standards, regulatory thresholds, and evidentiary requirements that could not be adjusted through influence alone. Brielle understood this transition as clearly as she understood the system she had exposed. Inside the company, information had been managed through access. Outside it, information would be tested through verification. And verification required structure. She arrived at Margaret Cole's office shortly after noon, entering through a private access point that bypassed the reception area. The building itself was unremarkable, its exterior offering no indication of the level of legal activity it contained, but inside movement had accelerated. Assistants moved quickly but without urgency, their coordination suggesting familiarity with situations that required immediate attention without visible disruption. Margaret was already in the conference room when Brielle entered a series of documents arranged across the table in a pattern that reflected both organization and prioritization. She did not greet Brielle immediately. Instead, she finished reviewing a page before looking up. "It's moving faster than expected," she said. "Because it's no longer internal," Brielle replied. Margaret nodded slightly. "External confirmation has begun. We've already received preliminary inquiries from regulatory counsel." "Which agencies?" "2, possibly 3. Securities oversight is certain. Federal inquiry is likely. There's also interest from financial crimes enforcement." Brielle absorbed that without visible reaction. "Good," she said. Margaret watched her for a moment, not with surprise, but with recognition. "You anticipated this level of escalation?" "Yes." Margaret leaned back slightly, folding her hands. "Then we proceed carefully," she said. "From this point forward, everything is formal. Every statement, every document, every interaction is part of the record." Brielle nodded. "I understand." Margaret reached for a separate folder and opened it, revealing a structured summary of the evidence Brielle had compiled. Unlike the original documents, this version had been translated into legal form, each element categorized according to relevance, admissibility, and potential impact. "We'll begin with controlled disclosure." Margaret continued. "Not to the public. To regulatory bodies. They will request access, and we will provide it under defined conditions." "And the company?" Brielle asked. "They will respond," Margaret said, "but their response is no longer primary. They are now subject to review." That distinction marked the shift. Vaughn Dynamics was no longer the authority. It was the subject. Across the city, in a separate conference room that carried the weight of long-standing decision-making, Charles Vaughn sat with his legal team reviewing the same material from a different position. The documents had reached him through multiple channels, not all of which he controlled. That alone confirmed the loss of containment. The system he had built relied on centralized oversight, on the ability to track, manage, and adjust information before it reached external scrutiny. Now that oversight had fractured. His legal counsel spoke in measured terms, outlining options that were no longer strategic but reactive. "We need to establish a timeline," one of them said. "Define when these structures were implemented, under what authority, and with what documentation." Charles did not interrupt. He listened, not because he agreed, but because listening allowed him to assess the limits of response. "And we need to prepare for immediate inquiry," the counsel continued. "Preservation orders are likely. We cannot alter or remove any internal records at this stage." That limitation was understood. What had once been adjustable was now fixed. Charles leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Then we respond," he said. The words were simple, but their meaning had changed. Response no longer meant control. It meant engagement under conditions defined by others. Axel Vaughn, meanwhile, had been called into a separate meeting. Not by his father, by the same legal team. The room was smaller, the tone more direct. Documents were placed in front of him without explanation. He recognized them immediately. Not because he had seen them in this form before, but because he had participated in their origin. "Your name appears in multiple authorization layers," the attorney said. Axel did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He looked at the pages, his expression controlled, but no longer detached. "These were operational decisions," he said. "Operational decisions with legal implications," the attorney replied. Axel remained silent, because the distinction was no longer useful. "What we need from you," the attorney continued, "is clarity. Your level of awareness, your level of involvement, and your understanding of how these structures were implemented." Axel's response came after a pause. "I understood enough," he said. That answer, while incomplete, was sufficient, because it established awareness. And awareness in this context established responsibility. Back at Margaret's office, Brielle reviewed the legal summary in detail, noting where language had been adjusted, where emphasis had shifted, where documentation had been reframed to align with procedural requirements. The transformation from internal record to legal evidence was precise, and she followed it carefully, ensuring that nothing essential had been altered in the process. Margaret observed her without interruption. "You're not surprised by any of this?" she said. "No, you're not concerned. I'm aware." Margaret nodded. "Then you understand what comes next." Brielle closed the folder. "Yes, say it," Margaret said. Brielle met her gaze. "Formal investigation, asset review, potential charges, and your role, witness, contributor." Margaret held her gaze for a moment longer. "And defendant, if they decide your timeline implicates you." Brielle did not look away. "I've documented my position." "You have," Margaret agreed. "But documentation does not eliminate risk. It manages it. That's sufficient." Margaret accepted that, because it was accurate. Later that afternoon, the first official request arrived. Not from media, from a regulatory body. A formal notice of inquiry requesting access to specific financial records, transaction histories, and internal communications related to the structures Brielle had identified. It was not an accusation. It was the beginning of one. Margaret reviewed it carefully before handing it to Brielle. "This is where it becomes procedural," she said. "Everything moves through defined channels. There are no informal discussions from this point forward." Brielle read the document once. Then again, "Respond," she said. Margaret nodded. "We will." Outside, the narrative had begun to take form. Not through headlines, through alignment. Journalists who had received fragments of the story were now connecting them to external confirmations. Analysts began to question irregularities in Vaughn Dynamics' financial history. Investors, though not yet reacting publicly, were already reassessing their positions. The system was no longer silent. It was being examined. Brielle remained at the table as Margaret's team began preparing the formal response, her presence no longer required for action, but still integral to understanding. She did not involve herself in every detail. She did not need to. Her role had shifted from builder to participant. By the time the sun began to lower over the city, casting long shadows across buildings that had no awareness of the shift occurring within them, the process had moved beyond initiation. It had entered continuation. And continuation, once established within legal frameworks, did not depend on momentum. It depended on structure. Brielle understood that. She did not rush it. She did not attempt to influence it beyond what she had already set in motion. Because from this point forward, the system she had exposed would be examined not by those who built it, but by those trained to dismantle it. The formal proceedings did not begin with confrontation. They began with structure. Within 48 hours of the initial inquiry, Vaughn Dynamics was no longer operating under the assumption of internal resolution. The company had entered a phase in which every action, every document, and every statement existed within a framework defined by external authority. That shift was not visible in the architecture of its headquarters, nor in the behavior of employees moving through its corridors. But it was present in the way access was restricted, in the way communication was routed, and in the way decisions were no longer made without consultation. Brielle attended the first formal session not as a defendant, not as an accuser, but as a recorded participant. The setting was deliberate. A federal conference room neutral in design, absent of branding, constructed to remove influence from environment. There were no visual indicators of status, no elevated positions, no symbols of authority beyond the process itself. Margaret sat to Brielle's right. Across the table were representatives from regulatory bodies, legal counsel, and two members of the Vaughn Dynamics board who had been designated to observe but not intervene. Axel was present. Charles was not. That absence was noted, not discussed. The session began without introduction. A lead investigator, measured in tone and precise in language, outlined the purpose. This proceeding is for clarification of financial structures identified in submitted documentation, including but not limited to transaction sequences, authorization records, and associated communications. The objective is to establish continuity, responsibility, and intent. There was no accusation in the statement, only direction. Brielle understood the distinction. She was asked to confirm her role. Chief Financial Officer of Vaughn Dynamics. Duration of employment. Scope of responsibility. She answered each question without elaboration. Her responses concise, aligned with documentation already provided. The investigator then shifted. When did you first identify irregularities in company financial structures? Brielle provided the date. Not approximate, exact. And what actions did you take upon identifying these irregularities? I documented them, she said, independently. Why independently? Because internal reporting channels were part of the structure I was reviewing. The investigator paused briefly, not in disagreement, in acknowledgement. Did you discuss these findings with any member of executive leadership prior to submitting them externally? No. Why not? Brielle's answer did not change in tone. Because prior discussion would have altered the structure before it could be verified. The room remained still. Not because the answer was unexpected, but because it was complete. Margaret did not intervene. There was no need. The process continued. Please explain the role of Northlake Holdings LLC within the identified transaction sequences. Brielle described the entity, its function, its positioning within the broader network. She did not speculate. She referenced documentation, each statement aligned with evidence already submitted. The investigator nodded once, then turned slightly. Mr. Vaughn. Axel looked up. His posture remained controlled, but the environment had shifted around him. In this space, control did not come from position. It came from clarity. You have reviewed the submitted documentation, the investigator said. Yes. Do you recognize your authorization signatures within these records? A pause. Not long, but deliberate. Yes. Can you describe the context in which those authorizations were provided? Axel exhaled once before responding. They were part of operational approvals, he said. mid-level confirmations within existing financial structures. Did you question those structures at the time? No. Why not? Another pause. This one longer. Because they were presented as established, Axel said, as necessary for operational flexibility. The investigator leaned forward slightly. And you accepted that without verification. Axel did not respond immediately. No, he said finally. That answer settled into the record. Not dramatic, not emotional, but definitive. The investigator continued. Were you aware that these structures facilitated the movement of funds through offshore entities in a manner that may violate regulatory standards? Axel's gaze shifted briefly, not toward Brielle, toward the documents in front of him. I was aware that funds were being routed, he said. I was not fully aware of the legal implications. The distinction was noted, not challenged, yet. Were you aware that your father, Charles Vaughn, authorized primary transaction sequences within this structure? Yes. And did you question those authorizations? Axel's silence extended. Not uncertain, measured? No. The investigator made a note, then turned back to Brielle. Miss Hart, you have provided documentation indicating that Mr. Vaughn's involvement extended beyond awareness. Brielle nodded once. Yes. Can you elaborate? She reached for a file, opened it, selected a document. This is an amendment to the original financial structure, she said. It includes direct authorization signatures from both Charles Vaughn and Axel Vaughn, establishing continuity between initial design and subsequent execution. The document was passed across the table. The investigator reviewed it, then passed it to the legal counsel, then to Axel. Axel did not react outwardly, but he did not deny it, because denial at this stage required contradiction, and contradiction required evidence he did not have. The investigator spoke again. Mr. Vaughn, do you recognize this document? Yes. Do you dispute its authenticity? No. That answer shifted the session, not dramatically, but structurally, because authenticity, once confirmed, removed the need for argument. What remained was interpretation, and interpretation in legal proceedings followed evidence. The session continued for several hours. Questions moved through layers, transactions, communications, authorization hierarchies. Brielle's responses remained consistent. Axel's responses remained controlled. But the distinction between them became clearer with each exchange. Brielle described. Axel explained. Description relied on evidence. Explanation relied on context. And context without evidence held less weight. By the end of the session, no conclusions were announced. No decisions were declared. That was not the purpose. The purpose was record. And the record was now complete enough to proceed. Outside the room, the process expanded. Additional sessions were scheduled. Requests for further documentation were issued. Preservation orders were enforced across Vaughn Dynamics systems, ensuring that no data could be altered or removed. The company, once defined by its control over information, was now subject to it. Later that evening, the board convened separately, not for discussion, for decision. The meeting was brief, because the information had already been reviewed. The vote was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. A majority was sufficient. The resolution passed. Brielle Hart was appointed Interim Chief Executive Officer of Vaughn Dynamics, effective immediately pending the outcome of the investigation. The justification was clear. Continuity, stability, separation from implicated parties. The announcement was prepared, not yet released, because timing still mattered. Brielle received the notification shortly after it was finalized. She read it once, then closed the message. There was no visible reaction, because the position was not the outcome. It was the next phase. Axel received the same notification minutes later. His response was different, not outwardly, but internally, because what had once been assumed inheritance, continuation, had now been replaced with something else. Consequence. Charles Vaughn was informed through counsel. He did not respond immediately, not because he did not understand, But because response at this stage required more than reaction, it required strategy, and strategy required time. Time he no longer controlled. Brielle stood by the window of Margaret's office, looking out over a city that had not changed, though the structures within it had begun to shift. She did not reflect on what had happened. She did not anticipate what would follow. She remained present, because presence in a process like this required more than awareness. It required restraint. The system had been exposed, the process had begun. And Brielle Hart had moved not into power, but into position. A position that would now be tested, not by what she revealed, but by what she would choose to do next. The announcement was released at 8:00 a.m., not as breaking news, as confirmation. The statement from Vaughn Dynamics appeared across financial platforms with the same controlled language the company had used for years, but the structure of it had changed. It did not project stability, it referenced it. It did not assert continuity, it justified it. And within that careful framing, one line carried the weight of everything that had shifted. Brielle Hart had been appointed interim chief executive officer. There was no elaboration beyond necessity, no reference to the wedding, no acknowledgement of the disruption that had placed the company in this position. Only a brief note regarding an ongoing internal review, now under external oversight, and a commitment to cooperation with regulatory authorities. The omission was intentional, because the details were already public, or moving toward it. Within minutes, the announcement was contextualized by those outside the company. Analysts connected it to the emerging investigation. Journalists began to assemble timelines. Investors responded not with immediate withdrawal, but with recalculation, their attention shifting from growth projections to exposure. Vaughn Dynamics was no longer being evaluated for its performance. It was being evaluated for its structure. Inside the headquarters, the transition was operational, not ceremonial. Brielle entered the building through the same entrance she had used for years, her access unchanged, her presence neither announced nor concealed. Security protocols had been updated overnight, not to restrict her, but to restrict others. Certain departments now required dual authorization. Executive-level access had been segmented. Communication channels were routed through monitored systems that ensured traceability. The company was reorganizing itself in real time, not by choice, by necessity. Brielle moved through it without interruption. Employees acknowledged her as they always had, with professional restraint, though the awareness behind those acknowledgments had shifted. They had seen the announcement. They had read the reports. They understood, even if only partially, that the structure they operated within was no longer what it had been days earlier. But no one asked questions, because questions in this environment required positioning, and no one yet knew where to stand. Her office remained unchanged. The same desk, the same arrangement, the same clock still running 3 minutes fast. Brielle placed her bag down, turned on her monitor, and reviewed the schedule that had already been prepared for her. It had been adjusted overnight, expanded to include meetings that did not exist before. Regulatory briefings, internal compliance reviews, board check-ins, each one placed carefully within the day, each one requiring a different form of attention. She did not rearrange them. She followed them. The first meeting was with compliance, not to assign responsibility, to establish process. The room was filled with individuals who had spent years ensuring that Vaughn Dynamics operated within regulatory frameworks that now appeared insufficient. Their expressions reflected neither defensiveness nor denial, but recalibration. The recognition that the systems they had maintained were now being examined from a perspective they did not control. Brielle did not address past failures. She addressed present requirements. All records are to remain accessible, she said. No deletions, no modifications. Any request for alteration is to be documented and reported. Her tone was even, her language precise. This was not instruction, it was enforcement. The room understood, not because she raised her voice, but because she did not need to. The second meeting was with internal legal. Their role had shifted overnight from advisory to defensive. They outlined ongoing communications with external counsel, the scope of document requests, and the timelines that had already been established for response. Brielle listened. Then she clarified. "We are not limiting disclosure," she said. "We are structuring it." The distinction mattered. Limitation implied resistance. Structure implied control within constraint. Legal counsel adjusted accordingly. By midday, the first internal restructuring decision was made. Not publicly, but definitively. Several mid-level executives whose names had appeared repeatedly within the documented authorization chains were placed on administrative leave pending further review. The action was not punitive. It was procedural, but its impact was immediate. The company was no longer protecting its internal hierarchy. It was separating from it. Outside the company, the investigation continued to expand. Regulatory bodies issued additional requests, broadening the scope beyond initial transaction sequences to include historical financial reporting and external partnerships. Financial institutions connected to Vaughn Dynamics began conducting their own reviews, not as accusations, but as safeguards. The system was responding, not with chaos, with structure. Axel Vaughn did not return to the office. His access had not been formally revoked, but it had been restricted. His role, once assumed to be transitional, was now undefined. He remained in his apartment, reviewing documents that had already been reviewed by others, attempting to understand where awareness had become involvement, where involvement had become liability. There were no immediate answers, only records, and records did not negotiate. Charles Vaughn's position was more complex. He had not been removed, but he no longer operated. His authority, while not publicly revoked, had been functionally suspended through the appointment of Brielle and the restructuring of access controls. His communications were now routed through legal counsel. His presence within the company was no longer active. He understood the implications, not as loss, as transition, one that he had not initiated. Late in the afternoon, Brielle stood in the main conference room, now repurposed for a board briefing. The same individuals who had once operated with implicit alignment now sat with measured distance between them, their attention focused not on each other, but on the information in front of them. Brielle presented without embellishment. Current status of the investigation, scope of regulatory engagement, immediate operational changes. She did not speculate on outcomes. She did not assign blame. She defined structure. The board responded in kind. Questions were direct. Answers were recorded. Decisions were made with an awareness that each one would be examined beyond the room. When the meeting concluded, there was no sense of resolution, because resolution was not the objective. Continuation was. As evening approached, the building began to empty. Employees left in controlled intervals, their routines unchanged, though their understanding of the company had shifted in ways that would take time to fully register. Brielle remained, not because she needed to, but because presence at this stage reinforced stability. She returned to her office, reviewed the final reports of the day, and closed her laptop with the same measured motion she had used the night before. There was no satisfaction in what had been accomplished, no sense of completion, because the process was not over. It had only moved into a phase where her role required less action and more consistency. Before leaving, Brielle paused briefly at the window. The city outside remained unchanged. Traffic moved. Lights shifted. Nothing in its appearance reflected the structural change that had taken place within one of its most prominent companies. And yet that change was real, not because it had been announced, but because it had been verified. Brielle picked up her bag and left the office. No one stopped her. No one needed to, because what she had set in motion no longer depended on her presence to continue. It depended on process, and process once established within systems designed to examine truth did not stop. The final phase did not announce itself. It settled, not as an ending, but as a stabilization of everything that had already been set in motion. Weeks passed without spectacle. There were no dramatic revelations, no singular moment that defined resolution. Instead, the process continued through filings hearings and procedural steps that unfolded with the same precision Brielle had applied from the beginning. Each document submitted reinforced what had already been established. Each response narrowed the range of interpretation until only structure remained. The investigation concluded not with surprise, but with confirmation. Regulatory findings aligned with the documentation Brielle had provided. The financial structures operating through offshore entities were deemed intentional, constructed in a manner that violated multiple reporting and compliance standards. Responsibility was not assigned broadly. It was defined specifically. Charles Vaughn was formally charged, not immediately removed from public recognition, not publicly dismantled in a way that resembled spectacle, but legally identified as the central authority behind the system that had been built. The language of the charges was measured technical precise. It did not dramatize. It documented. Axel Vaughn was not charged in the same way, but his position did not remain intact. His involvement once clarified through records, and his own statements established a level of awareness that could not be separated from consequence. He was removed from all operational roles within Vaughn Dynamics. His access was revoked formally this time, not as a precaution, but as a resolution. His name remained within the documentation, not as the origin of the structure, but as part of its continuation. The distinction mattered legally. It did not protect him from outcome. Inside Vaughn Dynamics, the restructuring moved from reaction to design. What had begun as containment evolved into redefinition. Departments were reorganized with an emphasis on transparency, not as a public gesture, but as a functional requirement. Reporting systems were rebuilt not to appear compliant, but to ensure traceability at every level. External auditors were integrated into processes that had previously been managed internally, removing the possibility of isolation. Brielle did not present these changes as reform. She implemented them as structure. Her role as interim CEO transitioned into permanence through a formal board decision that did not require public emphasis. The announcement was brief, aligned with the company's new approach to communication. There was no narrative attached to her appointment, no attempt to frame it as transformation. It was presented as continuation under revised conditions. That was enough. Brielle moved through her days without altering her pace. Meetings remained structured. Decisions remained measured. Her office did not change. The clock still ran 3 minutes fast. Those who worked with her adjusted gradually, not because she demanded it, but because the system now required a different level of precision. Assumptions were no longer sufficient. Every action required documentation. Every decision required alignment with processes that no longer allowed for ambiguity. The company did not become quieter. It became clearer. Outside, the narrative shifted, not away from Vaughn Dynamics, but into context. What had once been treated as a singular event was now analyzed as part of a broader pattern within corporate structures that relied on complexity to obscure accountability. Analysts referenced the case in discussions of regulatory reform. Legal experts cited it in examinations of internal oversight failure. It became an example not because it was unique, but because it had been exposed with clarity. Brielle did not engage with that narrative. She did not participate in interviews. She did not offer commentary. Her role was not to interpret what had happened. It was to ensure that what remained could not be repeated. The meeting with Axel occurred without arrangement. It was not scheduled. It was not avoided. It happened because their paths still intersected within the same city, though no longer within the same structure. He waited outside the building where Brielle now worked his presence. Noticeable, but not disruptive. When she exited, she saw him immediately, not because she was looking for him, but because she had already considered the possibility that he would be there. He stepped forward, not close enough to impose, not distant enough to avoid acknowledgement. "Can we talk?" he said. Brielle did not answer immediately. She considered him, not as he had been, as he was. Then she nodded once. They moved to a quieter space nearby, not private, but removed enough to allow conversation without interruption. Axel spoke first. "They've finalized everything," he said. "Yes." His voice carried no surprise, only confirmation. "I thought it would feel different," he continued. Brielle waited. "It doesn't." "No," she said. "It doesn't." A pause followed. Not uncomfortable, defined. "I've been trying to understand where it changed," Axel said, "when it became something I couldn't control." Brielle's response was immediate. It was never something you controlled. Axel absorbed that, not as correction, as recognition. "I could have stopped it," he said. "Yes, I didn't know." Another pause, this one longer. "I thought I understood the system," Axel said. "I thought I could operate inside it without becoming part of it." "That's not how systems like that work," Brielle replied. Axel looked at her. For the first time, there was no attempt to frame his position, no effort to reposition himself within the outcome. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Brielle did not respond immediately. She considered the question not for its emotional weight, but for its structure. "No," she said. Axel nodded once. "I didn't think you would." Silence returned. Not empty, complete. There was a moment, Axel said after a while at the altar. "I thought I was taking control, that I was choosing something." Brielle met his gaze. "You were," she said, "just not in the way you thought." Axel exhaled quietly. "That makes sense now." He did not ask for anything, not forgiveness, not understanding, because both required a framework that no longer existed between them. "I won't be part of anything like that again," he said. Brielle did not respond, not because she doubted him, but because his future choices no longer intersected with her responsibility. After a moment, Axel stepped back. "That's all I needed to say." Brielle nodded once. No closure, no continuation, only acknowledgement. He left without looking back. Brielle remained for a moment longer, not reflecting, not reconsidering, simply present. Then she turned and walked away, not toward anything new, not away from anything old. Forward. That evening she returned to her apartment. Not the penthouse that had once been associated with her position within Vaughn Dynamics. That space had been vacated weeks earlier, not as a rejection, but as a correction. It had never belonged to her. It had belonged to a structure that no longer existed. Her current apartment was smaller, functional, unremarkable. It did not require maintenance beyond what was necessary. It did not reflect status. It allowed for clarity. She placed her bag on the table, turned on a single light, and sat. The room was quiet, not because something was missing, because nothing unnecessary remained. Her phone rested beside her. No new notifications, no urgent messages. The process continued elsewhere. Without her. Brielle leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction, only alignment. Everything that had been set in motion had reached the point where it no longer depended on her. The system had been exposed. The structure had been corrected. The consequences had followed. Not through force, through verification. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, unaffected, or perhaps simply uninterested in the mechanisms that shaped it beneath the surface. Brielle did not need it to notice, because what mattered had already been established. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. And clarity, once achieved, did not require reinforcement. It remained. In the days that followed, Vaughn Dynamics continued to operate, not as it had been, as it now was, structured, observable, accountable, and Brielle Hart remained within it, not as someone who had taken power, but as someone who had never needed to claim it, because she had understood something others had not. Power, when built on concealment, required constant protection. But power, when aligned with truth, did not need to defend itself. She closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, in completion. And when she opened them again, nothing had changed, which was exactly the point. In the end, the story never asked for noise. It asked for attention. Not the kind that reacts quickly, but the kind that stays long enough to see what unfolds beneath the surface. Brielle never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never tried to force justice into existence. She prepared for it. She built it quietly, piece by piece, until the moment came when it no longer needed her to speak. Because truth, when structured properly, speaks for itself. If you've stayed with this story until now, then you already understand something most people overlook. Not every battle is fought in public. Not every victory looks like one. And sometimes the strongest response is the one that arrives without warning, without anger, and without the need to prove anything at all. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always grounding to see how far these stories travel and how many different lives they quietly connect. And if you believe that silence can be strength, that preparation matters more than reaction, then you may want to stay for the next story. Not because it will be louder, but because it will be just as true.